He was a handsome young father turned social justice warrior.
He had 2 twin daughters.
He was very active in the LGBTQ community of Kansas City.
He affected each person, and everyone loved him.
So when his life is taken too soon, the entire community is desperate for answers.
The shooter was within a foot of him when the bullet was fired.
His cell phone was gone.
Was this something planned?
It was the most horrific thing I've ever had to endure or encounter.
The investigation into his death will unveil a sinister plot that spiraled out of control.
They were flirting back and forth.
What we need you to do is just explain to us why your number is in his phone.
I never talked to the guy or texted the guy in my life.
He says this is something that we can keep between us.
What made you want to take him away from us? Just why?
Detectives just tell him point blank, you're full of...
You were there.
He didn't want to be a snitch, but he couldn't take the heat any longer.
Police, open up!
This story is so unbelievable.
Police!
He was gonna do whatever he needed to evade arrest.
14, Kansas City, Missouri. There's an exciting buzz in the air as local families prepare to celebrate Halloween.
Halloween is a lot of fun in Kansas City. In a matter of hours, the city will be bursting with trick-or-treaters, wild parties, and haunted houses.
But for local law enforcement, this time of year also means an uptick in crime.
Kansas City, like many other large metropolitan cities, has a crime issue. What's somewhat unique about Kansas City in particular is that much of our violent crime is committed by younger individuals.
We annually make the list of top cities for crime and violence.
So when gunshots ring out at 1 a.m. on Kansas City's south side, patrol officers are ready to spring into action.
Officers responded to the area where those gunshots were.
This is a dangerous area of Kansas City. The officers knew that this particular area was a place where drugs were commonly sold, used, and things of that nature.
A gold-colored sedan catches the officer's attention.
It was running with its lights on and all the doors were shut.
Officers cautiously approach the vehicle.
Jackson County Sheriff's Department, step out with your hands up.
They issue instruction to the occupant of the vehicle, come out.
Nothing happens. They try yelling louder.
Step out.
But no one comes out of the vehicle.
Eventually, one of the officers opens the driver's door.
They see what can only be described as a deceased individual with an apparent gunshot wound to his head.
Dispatch, go ahead and start homicide. We got 110-7.
Homicide detectives are on the scene within minutes.
They know they have a dead body, and now they want to identify that body.
Fortunately, the victim's wallet is still inside the car.
In his wallet, they find the driver's license, and that's when they're able to identify him as Mr. Deontay Green.
22-year-old Deontay Green always exuded love and light.
To know him was to love him. He had a heart of gold.
Deontay was a ball of energy. Like, he was so energetic. Goofy, play all day. He was himself at all times.
He was an active member in the community. He was a part of the Kansas City Marching Cobras. He was a part of the Kansas City Falcons, another drill team.
He had style. He used to dress from head to toe.
But nothing meant more to Deontay than his twin daughters, Diana and Tiana.
They were the center of his life.
You just look at them and you can see Deontay.
When we were with him, It would just be a fun moment. Like, we'll laugh, play around, take pictures, just hang out.
When it came to us, it was about us.
Deontay and his high school sweetheart, Kiana Rice, had become parents when they were still teenagers.
Even though their relationship fizzled out, they stayed close for their girls.
They was very good co-parenting the kids. They've been knowing each other all their lives, so they were like two peas in a pod. They were best friends.
By the fall of 2014, Deontay was ready to find love again.
Deontay was an openly bisexual man and began looking for love online.
He was looking for these avenues to try and find ways to connect with people, whether it be social media via Facebook or what have you.
He was very active in the LGBTQ community of Kansas City.
And for Deontay, part of being a member of the LGBTQ+ community meant giving back.
Deontay was a part of the House of Cavalli. He was also a part of Authentic. Those two organizations by itself, I can just go on and on about the different things that they've done. They're very active in their community as far as feeding the homeless, as far as going to go clean up communities. Wherever he could have his hand in, he was in.
He affected each person, and everyone loved him.
So how did he end up on the other side of town with a bullet to the head?
Detectives started to investigate the crime scene to see if there were any clues that may lead them to who was the killer of this young man.
They see an entry wound to the right of his right eye, but no exit wound.
There was stippling around the gunshot wound.
When a gunshot is fired, if you are close enough to the target, it will actually leave stippling, which are small burn marks that are left by the gunpowder. And so that would indicate that the shooter was within approximately a foot of Deontay when the bullet was fired.
Detectives believe the shooter fired their gun from the back seat of the vehicle.
On the floorboard of the back seat, they find a shell casing, and the caliber of that shell casing is what's called a 400 Corbon.
The only way you can fire the 400 Corbon round is with a modified .45 caliber handgun.
400 Corbon isn't a very common round. It's certainly not a very common round that you see used in criminal acts.
Was Deontay the unfortunate victim of a robbery gone wrong?
Certainly, if it was a robbery, the perpetrators would want to take anything of value that they could find.
But he still has his wallet.
That certainly indicated that this wasn't just your run-of-the-mill robbery.
However, there is one key item missing.
His cell phone was gone. Why would the killer take his phone and not his wallet?
"22-year-old father of two, Deontay Green, was ready to find love again.
He had two twin daughters, but the relationship with their mother turned out to be more like a friendship.
He was an openly bisexual man. He was very active in the LGBTQ community of Kansas City.
But just after 1 a.m. on October 31st, 2014, investigators have found Deontay on Kansas City's seedy South Side with a gunshot wound to the head.
It was a mystery how Deontay even ended up in this part of town. He was an upstanding guy.
Was this a robbery? Was this somebody he knew? Was this an isolated incident? Was this something planned?
Oddly enough, the killer appeared to take his cell phone and not his wallet. Why would they do that if this was a robbery?
Before they can answer that question, detectives have the grim task of notifying Deontay's loved ones of what's transpired.
I guess it was about 11 a.m. in the morning. A knock is at the door, and there are two detectives. And they're asking me if Deontay Green lives here. Yes.
Yes, I'm his mother. He's been living with me recently.
That's when detectives deliver the heartbreaking news.
All I can remember him saying is, Miss Green, your son was murdered. I don't know what happened after that.
Murdered last night.
I'm hurt and I'm in disbelief. Like, no, not my son. It was the most horrific thing I've ever had to endure or encounter.
Where did you find him?
On the south side, in an area with a lot of crime and drug activity.
Was Deontay involved in any kind of illegal drugs?
Ms. Green was very surprised over the question.
Absolutely not.
My son didn't do drugs. I did everything within me to make sure the streets don't swallow him up. He didn't hang around that type of crowd. I'm puzzled as to what he was even doing down there.
Deontay was an outstanding citizen. It was a part of town that Deontay Green would not otherwise have been in, unless somebody else told him to go there.
Can you think of any reason why someone would want to harm your son?
I drew a blank because I couldn't think of not one individual that would want to harm him in such a manner. He didn't have any enemies.
He was just a likable person that everybody liked because he tried to do the right thing all the time.
I told them if I had to point a finger or anything, it was because of his sexuality, him being bisexual.
Was Deontay the victim of a callous hate crime?
Homophobia is still an open discussion within this society, and not everybody seems to understand the dynamics around it. So when Deontay was killed, police had to take this into account with their investigation.
When was the last time you saw your son?
Last night around 11.
He say, Mom, I'm about to go grab something to eat with some friends. And I say, okay, love you, be good. And he said, okay, I love you too. I'll be back.
All right, see you later, Mama.
Okay.
My son told me he was coming back to me.
Detectives now wonder if the friends Deontay said he was going out with that night turned out to be killers.
Do you have names for the individuals he was going to hang out with?
Unfortunately, no.
Thank you so much for your time, Miss Green, and again, we're so sorry for your loss.
Thank you, detectives.
As investigators scour Kansas City for Deontay's killer, news of his death echoes throughout the community.
A couple of days after his death, we did a memorial.
I honestly didn't think that I would walk into a memorial with over 300 people. It was huge. It was really beautiful because a lot of people that was there has showed how much they cared and loved him.
The outpour of love and support that the city showed my family and I spoke volumes of who Deontay was.
For investigators, it's puzzling that anyone would seek to harm such a beloved member of the community like Deontay Green.
They were really having trouble piecing together how and why this happened.
Until a young man named Greg Bailey shows up at the station to speak with them.
What can I do for you?
This gentleman has some information for you.
Okay, come on in.
Greg was Deontay's good friend, and he told detectives that he might have some vital information about the last hours of his life.
He is really the person who broke the case open for the most part.
Okay, Greg, tell us what you know.
Greg tells detectives that on the night of the 30th, Deontay made plans to meet up with a mysterious young man he'd met on Facebook.
He didn't know the name of the individual that Deontay was meeting up with, but Deontay had described him as cute and having dreads.
Deontay told him that there was something about this guy in this picture that pulled him in.
However, was Deontay's handsome suitor really a wolf in sheep's clothing?
He said we could meet up, but there's something I need you to bring me.
He says this is something that we can keep between us.
Kansas City detectives investigating the murder of 22-year-old Deontay Green are finally getting their first lead, thanks to Deontay's best friend, Greg Bailey.
He said Deontay was looking to meet up with a mysterious individual on the night of the 30th.
They've been talking online. On Facebook?
But according to Greg, Deontay's mysterious suitor had a stipulation for their meetup.
He said we could meet up, but there's something I need you to bring me.
The guy requested that Deontay would bring some marijuana with him.
Deontay didn't do drugs, wasn't into it, so he told the man if he brought the money and knew somewhere to go get the weed, that he would take him.
The whole thing seemed kind of sketchy to me. I told Deontay it was a bad idea.
He tried to discourage him. Deontay Green decided to go anyway.
Greg tells detectives Deontay called him around midnight after he arrived to meet his date.
He still hasn't arrived yet?
No, I'm still sitting here, waiting.
And then Deontay started to see a guy walking towards the car.
But the man wasn't alone.
Wait, there's another guy.
Another guy?
It was another guy coming out with them, and he didn't know what he was coming out for.
Hey, you doing okay? Yeah, how are you? Good. Sorry, we actually gotta go to the gas station first to get cash, if that's okay. Oh, yeah. That's okay, you sure? Yeah. Okay, all right. Yeah. Thank you, man, thank you. Hey, Greg, I'll call you later, okay?
Be careful, just call me later.
After that, Greg never heard from his best friend again.
After speaking with Greg, investigators are eager to access Deontay's social media account to see exactly who he was messaging to meet up with that night.
Law enforcement obtains a search warrant for the Facebook account of Deontay Green.
When they logged in, they noticed that Deontay had a ton of friends. It was obvious that Deontay was very well liked.
But it doesn't take long for them to locate the message thread they are looking for.
They can see that there is communication between Deontay Green and an individual with the Facebook handle Trade a Gunner, and it carries through to the early morning hours of Halloween.
The conversation starts with Deontay Green reaching out innocently, just simply reaching out, saying hello. Pretty quickly after that individual learned of Deontay Green's sexual preference, had learned that the reason he reached out to him was in a flirtatious manner or a romantic nature, he was appalled. He was insulted.
Trey's responses become aggressive at times.
He even told him if he keeps coming at him, he's gonna beat him up.
Deontay respected his decision and the conversation dropped. But not for long.
Later on, that same individual had a change of heart.
And at some point in their communication, they were flirting back and forth.
Deontay felt like the guy was actually interested, but may be scared or have some fear about meeting up with him.
Deontay would respond that this is something that we can keep between us.
Sometimes gay men or bisexual men have this battle internally with being open and being accepting of who they are versus the homophobia that is around them. So if you could imagine, being able to link or meet up with someone who is saying they're not gay, but they're expressing some interest, it can be validating or give a sense of acceptance to an openly gay or bisexual person.
In the very last message, Deontay gave Trey the Gunner his phone number, and then the messages stopped.
Detectives are eager to discover Trey DeGunna's real name so they can track him down for an interview.
If Trey DeGunna had actually texted Deontay, the officers could trace the number back to the real person.
When detectives obtain Deontay's phone records, they discover one particular number was in contact with Deontay 80 times the night he was killed.
They thought this must be Trey DeGunna.
They are able to trace the number to an individual by the name of Antonio Golston.
But Antonio Golston looks nothing like the man Deontay had been messaging with on Facebook.
He appeared to have a total different Facebook page that had no contact with Deontay.
Regardless, detectives want to speak with Antonio Golston ASAP.
Detectives tracked him down and brought him into the station for questioning.
Just show you this picture. You know anything about this guy at all? No, sir.
They asked him, how did he know the name Deontay Green? But he said the name doesn't ring a bell.
Well, there's a reason we've ended up here today, okay? You're saying you've never talked with him before over the phone?
No, sir.
Or via text?
No, sir.
At this point, detectives decide to turn up the heat.
We're working a death investigation, all right?
Yes, sir.
This guy that you're looking at, we found him dead.
Detectives confront him with the phone records, and they show that they have proof that he called him the night that Deontay died.
What we need you to do is just explain to us why your number is in his phone.
They ask him why. Why are you the last person to talk with Deontay Green before he was murdered?
I think you're nervous. I think you're scared. But we need to get over that. We need to move forward, okay?
All I can say is just try to find my cousin Trey. And that's it.
When Antonio says the name Trey, detectives' ears perk up.
Was he the Trey DeGunna they've been looking for?
You gotta find him.
In the fall of 2014, Kansas City detectives finally have a suspect in custody for the murder of 22-year-old Deontay Green.
Antonio Golston's phone number communicated with Deontay's roughly 80 times on the night of his murder.
But Antonio denies any involvement in Deontay's death.
I never talked to the guy or texted the guy in my life.
Investigators were confident they caught Antonio in a lie, but he claimed he had a perfect explanation for all of this.
Antonio Golston's response is, my cousin had my phone.
According to Antonio, his cousin Trey Shaw had asked to borrow his phone on the 30th.
Because his phone had been stolen. He gave his cousin his phone.
I don't know whatever Trey did, I didn't come from there that night. Like, pretty much, I was still at home.
And so Antonio Golston tells the officers that it is his cousin, Trey, who was conversating with Deontay Green before Deontay Green was murdered.
So Trey's texting him?
Yes.
Okay.
And what's he look like? Light skin, dreads.
They showed him photographs of Trey DeGunna on Facebook, and he confirmed that that was his cousin.
All I can say is just try to find my cousin Trey. And that's it.
With Antonio's help, investigators quickly locate 18-year-old Trayvon Shaw.
They are able to bring him in for an interview. Trayvon denies any knowledge of ever knowing Deontay, ever being with Deontay, or anything of that nature.
That's when detectives confront him with the Facebook messages.
Man, no, those have to be fake.
He swears he's straight and would never agree to go out with a man.
Come on, Trey.
Look, man, that's not me. I don't know what to tell you.
Detectives aren't buying any of this.
As frustrating as it was, detectives did not have enough evidence to arrest Trayvon.
So they're forced to release him for the time being.
Before they let him go, though, they gathered his fingerprints.
As days pass, without any new developments in the case, Deontay's mother never gives up hope that her son's killer will be brought to justice.
I mean, day in and day out, I'm calling the detectives that had Deontay's case. I'm going to get answers. Deontay Green case would not go cold. I was hell-bent on not giving up, and I just was adamant in saying, this case will not go just thrown on the desk. This case will be solved.
And the pressure Koshel keeps on detectives is not in vain.
Based on the information they learned from Deontay's best friend, Greg, detectives believe that Deontay drove his killers to a gas station on the night of his murder.
Officers start scanning the area for gas stations, and they come across I believe it's a Shell gas station.
So they go to the Shell gas station and they look through that surveillance video, and what they find is the break in the case.
That's it.
They see the gold Dodge Stratus that Deontay was driving pull up to the Shell gas station.
In the passenger seat is a young man with locks.
A young man that looks just like 18-year-old Trayvon Shaw.
The individual gets out of the front passenger seat and attempts to withdraw money out of an ATM before going back out to the vehicle, getting in, and the vehicle drives off.
They have a suspect matching Trayvon Shaw's description exiting the Dodge Stratus at the Shell gas station right before the homicide.
And fingerprint results provide another smoking gun.
Investigators were able to lift some fingerprints from Deontay's vehicle.
When it comes back, the fingerprint on the passenger compartment of the Dodge Stratus that Deontay Green was murdered in matches Trayvon Shaw.
At this point, investigators are prepared to take down Trayvon Shaw for the murder of Deontay Green.
With guns drawn, detectives bang on the door, demanding that Trayvon come out with his hands up.
Police, open up! Don't make this harder than it has to be, Trey.
But Trayvon has no plans to go in willingly this time.
Officers made entry. Trayvon Shaw fled upstairs.
He was gonna do whatever he needed to evade arrest.
On November 6, 2014, Kansas City investigators are in the process of arresting 18-year-old Trayvon Shaw, their #1 suspect in the murder of Deontay Green.
Don't make this harder than it has to be, Trey.
But Trayvon is not going down easy.
At that time, officers made entry.
Police!
Trayvon Shaw fled upstairs and barricaded himself in an upstairs bedroom. They went inside. They found Trayvon Shaw hiding in the closet.
Put your hands up. Turn around.
They arrested him without incident.
Trayvon Shaw, you're under arrest for the murder of Deontay Green.
Back in the interrogation room, detectives waste no time confronting Trey with the new evidence they've collected.
What do you have to say about this?
Man, that's not me.
The footage is a little fuzzy, so at first, Trayvon denies that the man in the car is him.
However, Trayvon is quickly caught in his lie.
The same shoes he was wearing at the night of the homicide on the surveillance video is the same shoes he was wearing during his interview at the police station.
As if that wasn't enough, they then tell him his fingerprints are a match to the ones found inside Deontay's car.
And they show him the fingerprint that was lifted off of the passenger compartment. And Trayvon Shaw can't lie anymore.
He said he didn't want to be a snitch, but he couldn't take the heat any longer.
It was all my cousin Antonio's idea.
According to Trayvon, he was hanging out at Antonio's place. when Deontay messaged him on social media.
They ran in similar circles and had seen each other around town before. But this was the first time they had really spoken.
You gonna do it? I think you should do it.
Trey assured the detectives that he was straight and preferred women.
But Trey says his cousin encouraged him to play the part.
And Antonio encouraged him to pretend that he was actually interested in meeting up for a date.
Nah, check it out. Look, we're all that we, right?
Yeah.
And we both need money, right?
That is true.
Yeah. So this is our chance.
Antonio Golston told him he was going to rob Deontay Green.
And Trey would be the bait.
You in?
Yeah. Yeah, let's do it.
That's when Trey the Gunner started to respond again to Deontay and said they could meet up if he could get him some weed.
Text.
The duo used Antonio's phone to text back and forth with Deontay before meeting up with him.
When Deontay thought he was texting with Trayvon, he was actually texting with Antonio.
The duo met up with Deontay around midnight on the 31st, and Trayvon says he could tell Deontay was caught off guard by Antonio.
When they met up, it was a surprise because there was another guy. Where did he come from? Who is he? Why is he here?
Regardless, Deontay played it cool and agreed to help them obtain the marijuana they wanted.
Deontay drove them to the gas station to get cash.
Trey pretended to get the money for the weed out of the ATM, when in reality, his account was empty. And they planned on stealing the funds from Deontay.
Trayvon says Deontay drove them to the Southside neighborhood where he believed they'd be purchasing the marijuana. And that's when all hell broke loose.
Give me your wallet. Wait, what? Give me your wallet. Man, get the hell out of my car.
His story is that Golston pulled out the firearm and there was a struggle. And then all he knows is the gun went off.
Oh, damn.
And now you've got a dead body and 2 people in the vehicle and a robbery gone wrong.
Trayvon explains they couldn't find Deontay's wallet in the panic, so all they left with was his phone.
They took the phone since it was just lying there.
It happened so fast. I didn't know what to do. Antonio took off, so I followed him.
Was Antonio really the mastermind all along? Or was Trayvon just trying to cover for himself?
When analyzing the data from Antonio Golston's cell phone, they come across photographs of Antonio holding firearms. They also find text messages in which Antonio is telling another individual that he recently got a 400 Korban.
With this new evidence in tow, detectives circle back around to Antonio.
They started by confronting him with Trey's statement.
We only have one side of the story right now, and that story paints a gruesome picture. I mean, it sounds like a Lifetime movie.
They give him one final opportunity to give his version of the events. He again denies any knowledge of what happened to Deontay Green.
So detectives change course.
You mess with guns at all? You ever do like any Facebook photos with guns or anything like that? No, sir. You have any guns that you keep at your house for safety?
No.
Protection? Carry guns with you? What about?
I don't do guns, period.
But detectives are prepared to catch Antonio in his lie.
We have a search warrant for the phone.
Okay.
Detectives are going through it.
Okay.
There's pictures of you taking selfies. There's pictures of you with holding guns on that phone.
Detectives just tell him point blank, Antonio, you're full of and they all have a good laugh about it. It's like a child being caught. There's nothing for him to do but laugh at how unbelievable his own story is.
You were there.
I really wasn't there. Now what? I'm done talking. Take him to the cell.
I mean, that's it. That's how you want to leave it.
Like that. Because, like, y'all ain't gonna believe me anyways. Just take him to the cell.
Investigators now have enough evidence to charge both Antonio Golston and Trayvon Shaw with second-degree murder. But Deontae's family still has a tough road ahead of them.
Well, Trayvon Shaw, he wasn't the gunman. So it was like, do we really want to go to trial against him, or would you like to take a plea deal? My response, absolutely not.
Now we have to go to trial. Now we have to look these people in the eye that killed Deontay and took him from us.
His killers or killer will be brought to justice if it's the last thing I did.
In June 2015, investigators in Kansas City have finally charged 21-year-old Antonio Golston and 18-year-old Trayvon Shaw for the death of Deontay Green.
It felt so good to know that now we have the guys, but the hardest part was now we have to go to trial. Now we have to look these people in the eye that killed Deontay and took him from us.
Between the phone records and Trayvon's statement, prosecutors feel certain a jury will convict Antonio. But they aren't as confident about securing a conviction against Trayvon.
It's kind of like a 50-50, they said. It was a lot of circumstantial evidence. They didn't have the murder weapon, and he wasn't the trigger man.
But Cochelle is determined to see both men face justice for her son's death.
The prosecutors asked, would you like to take a plea deal? My response, absolutely not. No, I'm gonna trust in God and I'm gonna go, let's do the trial. His killers will be brought to justice if it's the last thing I did.
In May of 2016, Trayvon Shaw's trial begins. Prosecutors explain why Trayvon was an integral part of what happened to Deontay, even though he didn't pull the trigger.
Deontay Green had reached out to Trayvon Shaw innocently, hoping for some type of connection. Trayvon Shaw and Antonio Goldston learned that pretty quickly, and they knew they could exploit that.
You in? Yeah.
Deontay Green was there for Trayvon Shaw. He wasn't there for Antonio Goldston.
However, when the jury retires to deliberate, they decide to show Trayvon mercy.
Instead of second-degree murder, he was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to only 17 years in prison.
The jury agreed that Trayvon Shaw took part, but I think the jury believed, hey, he knew this was a robbery, but he didn't think it was going to be a murder.
It's a disappointing verdict for Deontay's loved ones.
I get that he wasn't the trigger man, but he's the sole purpose and reason why we're here. It was because of him.
At Antonio Golston's trial in the winter of 2016, he continues to maintain his original story, that he wasn't even there that night.
His story was he wasn't even in the car the night that my son was killed. He was so nonchalant. It was ridiculous.
However, just like Trayvon's case, the jury at Antonio's trial forgoes second-degree murder charges.
Antonio Goldston, at the end of his trial, was convicted of 1 count of voluntary manslaughter, 2 counts of armed criminal action, and 1 count of robbery in the first degree.
Antonio is sentenced to just 25 years behind bars.
25 years still isn't enough. When he get out, he'll still have a life. His mother can still call him. He can still call his mother. They can still visit. I can't talk to my son. I have to remember our last conversation of saying, I love you, be good, I'll see you later. Or I have to go to a grave site to visit my son, or look at pictures to remember him.
When both of the guys were found guilty, it made me feel a little bit relieved, but it didn't bring him back. So, I mean, it was hard. It's still hard.
Today, Deontay's legacy continues to live on through his twin daughters, Dayana and Tiana.
When Deontay passed away, Dayana and Tiana were 7 years old.
We just talk, just ramble about him sometimes. We had memories. Just hear his voice or just see.
August 1969. Los Angeles looked almost unreal beneath the late summer sun. Palm trees leaned over wide boulevards, swimming pools reflected cloudless skies, and the promise of Hollywood seemed to float through the warm evening air like something permanent. To those looking from the outside, the city represented freedom. It was a place where actors chased impossible dreams, musicians reinvented popular culture, and young people believed an entirely new world could be built from music, love, and rebellion. Newspapers wrote about a generation breaking away from old traditions. Magazine covers celebrated youth. Every sunset over the Hollywood hills appeared to whisper that tomorrow would be brighter than yesterday. Yet beneath that beautiful surface, another story had already begun to unfold. It was quieter than the music pouring from Sunset strip clubs. It hid itself beyond television cameras and glamorous photographs. It lived on dusty ranches, in abandoned buildings, inside conversations that drifted farther and farther away from reality. It grew through manipulation instead of affection, through fear disguised as belonging, and through absolute devotion to one man's increasingly distorted view of the world. History would eventually remember that man as Charles Manson. But the story was never only about him. It was about ordinary young people who surrendered their judgment to someone who promised certainty in an uncertain age. It was about families that would spend decades searching for answers that could never fully explain what happened. It was about investigators who found themselves confronting crimes unlike anything they had seen before. Most importantly, it was about innocent people whose futures ended during 2 nights that permanently altered the American understanding of violence, cults, and psychological control. Long before those names became headlines, before courtroom sketches filled newspapers across the country, before television commentators debated how such crimes could even be possible, there was simply another warm California evening. As daylight faded across Benedict Canyon, lights slowly appeared in the windows of hillside homes overlooking Los Angeles. Cars wound through narrow roads lined with trees and expensive estates hidden behind gates. Dinner conversations drifted through open windows. Radios played familiar songs. Dogs barked in distant neighborhoods before settling into silence again. Nothing about the night suggested that, by sunrise, one address would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in modern American history. There are moments that divide history into 2 chapters. People remember exactly where they were when they first heard about the assassination of a president, the collapse of famous buildings, or disasters that seemed impossible only hours before they happened. The murders at Cielo Drive would become one of those moments. Not because they involved political power or military conflict, but because they shattered something far less visible. They shattered the illusion that evil always announces itself. Until then, many Americans believed horror belonged somewhere else. It belonged in distant wars, dark alleyways, or stories printed in detective magazines. It was not supposed to arrive at the doorstep of successful artists, respected professionals, and people whose lives appeared touched by extraordinary fortune. The victims had done nothing to invite what was coming. That simple fact made the crimes even more terrifying. 4 years afterward, investigators, psychologists, journalists, and historians would return to the same question again and again. How could a group of young people, many of whom had once been described as gentle, idealistic, or deeply spiritual, carry out acts of such overwhelming brutality against complete strangers? The answer could not be found in a single night. Nor could it be explained by one man's charisma alone. To understand those murders, it would become necessary to travel backward through months of manipulation, isolation, emotional dependence, and the gradual destruction of individual identity. Every decision, every conversation, every seemingly insignificant encounter would become another thread in a web that tightened until escape became almost impossible for those caught inside it. That is what makes this case endure more than half a century later. It is not remembered solely because of the violence. It is remembered because it forces an uncomfortable question upon every generation that studies it. How does an ordinary human being become willing to obey an extraordinary command? The answer is rarely immediate. It does not usually begin with blood. It begins with trust. It begins with loneliness. It begins with someone offering certainty to people searching for meaning. California during the late 1960s was filled with those searches. Across beaches, college campuses, music festivals, and communes, thousands of young Americans rejected the lives their parents had built. Some searched for peace. Others searched for spirituality. Many simply searched for somewhere they felt understood. Most found communities that celebrated art, music, friendship, and personal freedom. A very small number wandered somewhere much darker. In hindsight, warning signs appear obvious. They always do. Looking backward, people wonder why no one recognized the danger sooner. Why friends did not intervene. Why families could not bring their children home. Why someone failed to stop events before they reached the point of no return. Reality is rarely that simple. Manipulation often arrives gradually. It reshapes beliefs one conversation at a time. It replaces doubt with loyalty, then loyalty with obedience. By the time outsiders recognize what has happened, the people inside may no longer see themselves as trapped at all. That uncomfortable truth would become one of the lasting lessons investigators and psychologists drew from the Manson family. But those lessons came later. In August 1969, none of them existed yet. Police officers did not know they were about to confront one of the most unusual murder investigations in American history. Reporters had no idea that the names Charles Manson, Sharon Tate, and Cielo Drive would soon dominate front pages around the world. Families across Los Angeles went to bed believing the city they loved would wake to another ordinary summer morning. Instead, dawn revealed something that felt almost impossible to comprehend. A quiet hillside residence had been transformed into a place of unimaginable loss. Within hours, photographers stood behind police barricades. Detectives moved carefully through rooms searching for evidence that refused to tell a straightforward story. Telephone lines filled with rumors. Radio stations interrupted regular programming. Television crews gathered outside the property while neighbors tried to understand how such violence could occur in a neighborhood associated with wealth, creativity, and success. The investigation that followed would stretch far beyond a single address. It would uncover a hidden community living according to rules entirely separate from the society surrounding it. It would expose the devastating consequences of psychological domination. And it would challenge the legal system with a question that seemed almost unprecedented. Could a man who never personally wielded the murder weapon still bear responsibility for every life that had been taken? That question would eventually be answered inside a courtroom. But before there were verdicts, before there were confessions, before there were headlines describing a cult that shocked the world, there were simply people whose lives intersected in ways none of them could have imagined. Some were pursuing careers. Some were preparing for parenthood. Some believed they had found a new family. Some believed they had found a new prophet. None of them could see how quickly those separate paths were moving toward the same devastating destination. And as another warm California night settled over Los Angeles, the city continued breathing with quiet confidence, completely unaware that one of the darkest chapters in its history had already begun. The California of the late 1960s existed in two completely different worlds at the same time. One was visible to everyone. It was the California that appeared on magazine covers and television screens, where endless sunshine, ocean breezes, and Hollywood glamour promised limitless opportunity. Young actors arrived every week carrying suitcases and impossible dreams. Musicians filled recording studios with songs that would define an entire generation. Directors searched for fresh ideas, photographers chased the perfect light, and artists believed they were standing at the beginning of a cultural revolution. To millions watching from across America and around the world, Los Angeles represented freedom in its purest form. The other California was far less visible. It existed beyond the polished neighborhoods and crowded beaches, hidden among isolated ranches, abandoned movie sets, and communities that deliberately separated themselves from conventional society. Thousands of young people had begun rejecting the expectations of their parents. Many questioned authority, the Vietnam War, traditional family structures, and the pursuit of material success. Some sought spiritual meaning through meditation or alternative religions. Others traveled from commune to commune, believing that love, music, and shared living could replace the values of the older generation. Most of those communities remained peaceful. They experimented with different ways of living, searching for purpose rather than conflict. But periods of rapid social change can also create opportunities for individuals who promise certainty to people searching for direction. History has repeatedly shown that charismatic leaders often emerge during moments of cultural uncertainty, offering simple answers to complicated questions. It was within that atmosphere that Charles Manson found people willing to listen. He did not look like the image many would later associate with one of America's most infamous criminal cases. Standing only a little over 5 feet tall, he lacked the commanding physical presence often imagined when people think of powerful leaders. Yet those who met him frequently described something more difficult to explain. He possessed an unusual ability to command attention. During conversations, he often maintained unwavering eye contact, adapting his words to the emotional needs of the person sitting across from him. To some, he appeared insightful. To others, deeply unsettling. Different people walked away with entirely different impressions, but very few forgot meeting him. By the time he arrived in California after years spent moving through correctional institutions, he had become skilled at observing people. He could often identify loneliness, insecurity, or a desire for acceptance within minutes. Rather than confronting those feelings directly, he offered something that seemed far more attractive. He spoke of belonging. He spoke of freedom from judgment. He encouraged people to believe they had discovered a family that would never abandon them. For several young men and women, those promises carried enormous emotional weight. Many members who eventually gathered around Manson were in their late teens or early 20s. Some had left difficult family situations. Others had drifted across the country searching for adventure or meaning. A few had experienced rejection or disappointment that left them eager for a place where they felt valued. Their backgrounds differed, but they shared a common vulnerability. They were searching for identity during a period when society itself seemed to be questioning everything. Researchers who later studied destructive groups emphasized that people do not usually join them because they desire violence. More often, they are drawn by the promise of friendship, purpose, or certainty. Harmful beliefs and behaviors tend to emerge gradually through processes of isolation, conformity, and increasing dependence on the group's leader. Accounts from former members and investigators suggest that the community surrounding Manson developed in much the same way. Life within the group revolved increasingly around his approval. Conversations stretched late into the night as he spoke about society, religion, music, race, and the future. His ideas were often inconsistent, shifting from one discussion to another, yet followers frequently interpreted those changes as evidence of deeper wisdom rather than contradiction. Over time, independent judgment gave way to group thinking. Personal boundaries became less important than loyalty to the collective. Isolation reinforced that process. Much of the group's time was spent away from ordinary social structures. Living together reduced contact with family members who might question the group's beliefs. Shared routines strengthened emotional dependence. As the circle became more closed, outside criticism could be dismissed as proof that the wider world simply failed to understand them. Among the places associated with the group was Spahn Ranch, a sprawling property northwest of Hollywood that had once served as a backdrop for Western films. By the late 1960s, its best years had long passed. Weathered wooden buildings stood beneath the California sun, surrounded by dusty trails and open fields. Horses still occupied parts of the property, but many sections carried the quiet atmosphere of a forgotten movie set. The contrast with glamorous Hollywood could hardly have been greater. To visitors, the ranch might have appeared isolated yet peaceful. To investigators looking back after the murders, it became an important setting for understanding how the group functioned. Distance from mainstream society allowed shared beliefs to deepen with fewer outside influences. Everyday routines centered increasingly on the internal dynamics of the community rather than the world beyond it. Meanwhile, Los Angeles continued moving at its usual pace. Production crews filmed movies across the city. Restaurants welcomed actors, writers, and producers discussing new projects late into the evening. Record labels searched constantly for emerging talent as popular music evolved at extraordinary speed. The optimism of the era remained visible in countless ordinary moments: friends gathering for dinner, couples planning futures together, artists believing their greatest work still lay ahead. Those separate worlds rarely seemed destined to collide. Yet they existed only miles apart. One celebrated creative ambition. The other revolved around growing ideological isolation. Neither fully understood the other. The distance between them was measured less in geography than in perception. Charles Manson himself harbored ambitions connected to the entertainment industry. He hoped to establish a career in music and believed recognition remained within reach. Several encounters introduced him, directly or indirectly, to individuals connected with the recording business and Hollywood circles. Those experiences did not lead to the success he desired. Historians continue to debate the degree to which disappointment influenced his later thinking, but there is broad agreement that his aspirations as a musician failed to develop into the career he imagined. As frustrations accumulated, his rhetoric became increasingly apocalyptic. He spoke of an approaching conflict that he believed would transform society. His interpretation drew loosely from popular culture, personal beliefs, and increasingly distorted conclusions that bore little resemblance to reality. Within the closed environment of the group, however, repeated exposure to those ideas gradually normalized them. Psychologists often describe this process as incremental commitment. Individuals rarely accept extreme beliefs all at once. Instead, each small step makes the next seem slightly less extraordinary. Over time, positions that once appeared unimaginable begin to feel internally consistent within the group's worldview. That gradual transformation helps explain one of the most disturbing aspects of the Manson family. The members did not appear to outsiders as monsters. Many had once lived ordinary lives filled with familiar hopes and relationships. Understanding how their thinking changed does not excuse the crimes that followed, but it remains essential to understanding how such events became possible. The broader culture also contributed to the complexity of the case. During the late 1960s, experimentation with drugs, alternative spirituality, communal living, and anti-establishment ideals occurred across many communities without leading to violence. Historians caution against equating the wider counterculture with the actions of the Manson family. The overwhelming majority of people involved in that cultural movement rejected violence and pursued peaceful social change. The Manson group represented a dangerous outlier rather than a reflection of the movement as a whole. That distinction would become increasingly important after the murders, when public fear sometimes blurred the difference between a destructive cult and the broader generation from which some of its members emerged. As summer settled over Southern California in 1969, few people outside the immediate circle surrounding Manson had any reason to believe his name would soon become known around the world. Police agencies were unaware that the isolated community would later occupy such a significant place in one of the nation's most consequential homicide investigations. The lives of strangers continued unfolding across Los Angeles, each following its own ordinary rhythm. In the hills above the city, creative professionals planned future projects. Families prepared for new chapters in their lives. Friends gathered for meals, conversations, and celebrations. Elsewhere, members of the Manson family continued living within a closed environment shaped by loyalty to their leader and increasingly detached from reality. The two worlds remained separate, moving quietly through the same summer beneath the same California sky. Neither could yet see how closely their paths were about to converge. In the decades since the events of August 1969, countless books, documentaries, and news reports have repeated the names associated with the Tate LaBianca murders. Yet over time, an unfortunate pattern emerged. The public often remembered the man who orchestrated the crimes more easily than the people whose lives were taken. Their identities became intertwined with one of the most infamous criminal cases in American history, and the extraordinary lives they had lived before those nights were sometimes reduced to a single tragic chapter. To understand the true weight of this story, it is necessary to begin somewhere entirely different. Not with a crime scene. Not with a courtroom, but with ordinary lives filled with plans for tomorrow. Sharon Tate was only 26 years old, yet she had already accomplished what countless young actors dreamed of achieving. Born in Texas and raised in a military family, she spent much of her childhood moving from one place to another as her father's assignments changed. Frequent relocations meant adapting to new schools, new friends, and unfamiliar surroundings. Those experiences quietly shaped her personality. People who knew her often described someone who remained remarkably warm despite constantly beginning again in unfamiliar places. As a teenager, she possessed a striking screen presence that naturally attracted attention, but those closest to her frequently recalled something less obvious than beauty. They remembered kindness. Crew members who worked alongside her spoke of someone who treated everyone with equal respect, whether they were directors, assistants, photographers, or newcomers working their first production. Hollywood offered opportunities, but it also demanded resilience. Success rarely arrived quickly, and every role carried expectations that extended far beyond acting itself. Sharon navigated that world with growing confidence, gradually building a career that seemed only beginning to reach its potential. Films introduced her to wider audiences, and industry professionals increasingly viewed her as an actress capable of far more than glamorous appearances. Her marriage to director Roman Polanski placed the couple among Hollywood's most closely watched creative partnerships. Friends described a relationship built around shared artistic ambitions and long conversations about future projects. Their home became a gathering place where filmmakers, writers, musicians, and friends could spend evenings discussing cinema, literature, and life. By the summer of 1969, another chapter had become far more important than any film. Sharon was expecting her first child. Photographs from that period show moments of quiet anticipation rather than celebrity. She smiled easily, carrying herself with the excitement familiar to countless parents preparing to welcome a new member of the family. Friends later remembered conversations about names, hopes for the future, and the ordinary adjustments that accompany impending parenthood. Those memories would become especially precious after August, preserving images of a woman looking toward life rather than imagining how history would remember her. Among those closest to Sharon was Jay Sebring. Long before celebrity hairstylists became widely recognized public figures, Jay had transformed his profession into an art form. After serving in the United States Navy, he pursued a career built upon creativity, discipline, and meticulous attention to detail. His work attracted actors, musicians, and public figures whose appearances shaped popular culture throughout the 1960s. Professional success never altered his reputation for generosity. Friends frequently described someone who remained loyal long after relationships changed. Although he and Sharon were no longer romantically involved, they maintained a close friendship rooted in mutual respect. That continued friendship reflected the maturity with which both approached an important transition in their lives. Jay had become an established businessman, but those who knew him best often remembered quieter qualities. He enjoyed meaningful conversation, valued loyalty deeply, and rarely hesitated to help friends facing difficulties. His achievements in Hollywood were significant, yet the people closest to him tended to speak first about his character rather than his accomplishments. Abigail Folger came from a family whose name was already well known in American business history. Material comfort had never been in short supply during her upbringing, yet wealth alone did not define her choices. She pursued education, developed broad intellectual interests, and became involved in charitable work that reflected genuine concern for people experiencing hardship. Friends described Abigail as thoughtful, curious, and compassionate. She enjoyed reading, discussing ideas, and supporting causes she believed could improve the lives of others. Those who met her often found someone who listened carefully before speaking, preferring sincere conversation over social attention. By 1969, she had become part of a creative social circle that included artists, writers, and filmmakers whose interests extended far beyond Hollywood glamour. Her relationship with Wojciech Frykowski reflected that environment of intellectual curiosity and cultural exchange. Frykowski had traveled a far more complicated path. Born in Poland, He grew up in a country shaped by the lasting consequences of the Second World War and the political realities that followed. Friends described him as intelligent, energetic, and endlessly fascinated by literature and cinema. Creative ambitions eventually led him toward opportunities outside Europe, where he hoped to build a future connected to storytelling and film. Adjusting to life in California presented both excitement and uncertainty. Like many immigrants pursuing creative careers, he faced the challenge of adapting to a different language, different customs, and an industry where success often depended upon timing as much as talent. Those close to him remembered someone who remained optimistic despite professional setbacks, believing that persistence would eventually create new opportunities. His life with Abigail reflected shared dreams rather than completed achievements. They represented countless young adults living in Los Angeles, convinced that tomorrow still held possibilities waiting just beyond the horizon. The youngest victim connected to the events at Cielo Drive had no connection to Hollywood's social circles at all. Stephen Parent was 18 years old. Unlike the others whose names would soon dominate international headlines, Stephen happened to be in the wrong place at the worst possible moment. He had recently graduated from high school and was beginning the uncertain transition into adulthood. Like many teenagers, he balanced work, friendships, and hopes for the future while trying to discover what direction his life might ultimately take. His interests centered on electronics, and he enjoyed repairing radios and other equipment. Family members later recalled a polite young man whose ambitions reflected ordinary hopes rather than extraordinary fame. He was neither wealthy nor connected to the entertainment industry. He simply crossed paths with circumstances no one could have anticipated. Remembering Stephen serves as an important reminder that tragedy often reaches beyond its intended targets, forever altering families who never imagined becoming part of a historic criminal investigation. The victims connected with the following night's crimes led equally ordinary lives. Leno LaBianca had built a successful career through years of consistent work. Friends described him as practical, dependable, and committed to providing stability for those around him. He represented the image of someone who believed in routine, responsibility, and the quiet satisfaction of building a comfortable home through determination rather than celebrity. His wife, Rosemary LaBianca, shared those values. Together they created a household centered on family, daily routines, and plans that reflected the ordinary aspirations of middle-class America. Their lives bore little resemblance to Hollywood parties or the changing counterculture taking shape elsewhere in Los Angeles. They occupied a different world entirely. That difference makes what followed even more difficult to comprehend. The people whose lives would eventually intersect through unimaginable circumstances had almost nothing in common. Their careers differed. Their backgrounds differed. Their neighborhoods differed. Some pursued artistic dreams beneath the spotlight of Hollywood. Others built quieter lives far removed from the entertainment industry. Yet each represented something profoundly ordinary. They believed another morning would arrive. They made plans for the following week. They spoke with friends about future vacations, upcoming work, family responsibilities, and everyday concerns so familiar that they rarely seemed worth remembering at the time. History often preserves the final chapter of a person's life while allowing everything before it to fade into the background. The Tate LaBianca case challenges that tendency. Before becoming victims, these individuals were sons and daughters, friends and partners, artists and professionals, people who laughed over shared meals, worried about unfinished work, celebrated personal milestones, and imagined futures they would never have the opportunity to experience. As the first week of August drew toward its close, Los Angeles continued moving beneath clear skies and warm evenings. Film productions remained busy. Restaurants filled with conversation after sunset. Families settled into familiar routines at home. Across the city, thousands of lives unfolded independently, none aware that history was quietly approaching one of its darkest turning points. For the people whose names would soon become inseparable from one of America's most studied criminal cases, life still belonged to the future. That future was measured in ordinary conversations, unfinished plans, and quiet expectations. None of them knew that the world was only days away from remembering their names for reasons no one could ever have imagined. The summer of 1969 had already become a defining period in American history. Across the country, people were witnessing enormous cultural changes. Music festivals gathered hundreds of thousands of young people. Political debates filled television screens. Traditional ideas about society, authority, and personal freedom were being questioned in ways that had rarely been seen before. But while much of America was focused on change and possibility, a small group hidden on the outskirts of Los Angeles was moving toward a completely different reality. The members of the group surrounding Charles Manson had spent months living under a belief system increasingly separated from the world outside. Their daily lives were shaped by Manson's interpretations of society, his predictions about the future, and his growing influence over their decisions. The events that unfolded over 2 nights in August 1969 would later become known collectively as the Tate-LaBianca murders. They were not the result of a random encounter between strangers. They were connected to a pattern of control, ideology, and obedience that investigators would spend months trying to understand. The first location was a house at 10050 Cielo Drive, located in the hills above Los Angeles. At the time, the property represented a very different image from the one it would later carry in public memory. It was a private residence in a quiet neighborhood known for its views, privacy, and connection to people working in the entertainment industry. The house had previously been associated with other figures from Hollywood, but in the summer of 1969 it was the home of actress Sharon Tate and several friends who were spending time together while her husband, Roman Polanski, was away working. The evening began like many other evenings. There were no obvious signs that anything unusual was about to happen. People moved through their normal routines. Conversations took place. Plans were made. The house remained a private space where friends gathered away from the public attention that often surrounded Hollywood. Among those present were Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, and Sharon Tate's friend. A young man named Stephen Parent was also connected to the location that night after visiting the property shortly before the events unfolded. The circumstances that brought everyone together were ordinary. Some were friends. Some had professional connections. Some were simply passing through a moment of everyday life. That ordinary quality is one reason the case continues to affect people decades later. The victims were not characters in a crime story. They were individuals whose lives had continued normally until an unexpected act of violence changed everything. During the early morning hours, members of the Manson group arrived at the property. The events that followed resulted in the deaths of everyone inside the house. The crime shocked investigators not only because of the loss of life, but because of the apparent symbolism left behind. The scene contained elements that suggested the perpetrators wanted to communicate a message beyond the immediate act itself. Those details would later become central to understanding the motivations and beliefs surrounding the group. At first, however, authorities did not know who was responsible. The investigation began with uncertainty. Law enforcement officers arriving at the property faced a scene that offered few clear answers. The victims had no obvious connection to a known enemy. There was no immediate suspect. There was no simple explanation for why such an event had occurred in a quiet Los Angeles neighborhood. The absence of a clear motive created confusion. Investigators considered different possibilities. They examined personal relationships, professional connections, and potential conflicts involving the people who lived in or visited the house. Like many major investigations, the first hours were filled with questions rather than conclusions. Meanwhile, the public reaction was immediate. News of the murders spread quickly through Los Angeles and soon across the country. The fact that the victims included a young actress who was widely recognized in Hollywood circles brought enormous attention. People struggled to understand how such violence could occur in a place associated with creativity, success, and celebrity. But the following night brought another tragedy. Less than 24 hours after the events at Cielo Drive, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were killed inside their Los Angeles home. Unlike the previous location, the LaBianca residence was not part of the Hollywood world. The couple represented a different side of Los Angeles life. They lived away from the entertainment industry, following the routines of work, family, and everyday responsibilities. Their deaths expanded the scope of the investigation. At first, investigators did not immediately understand that the two incidents were connected. The locations were different. The victims came from different backgrounds. There appeared to be no obvious relationship between the households. The possibility that the same group could be responsible for both crimes was not immediately apparent. As detectives worked through the evidence, they began to encounter similarities that suggested a larger pattern. The unusual messages left behind at both locations raised questions about motive. Investigators began looking beyond personal conflicts and toward the possibility that the crimes were connected to a belief system rather than a traditional motive such as revenge or financial gain. This distinction would become one of the most important elements of the entire case. The murders were not simply about what happened inside two homes. They were about understanding how a group of people could be influenced to carry out actions that most members of society would consider impossible. In the days following the crimes, Los Angeles entered a period of fear and uncertainty. Residents who had previously viewed their communities as safe began questioning whether danger could exist unnoticed nearby. The idea that a group living on the fringes of society could be responsible for such crimes challenged assumptions about criminal behavior. For investigators, the case became a search not only for individuals responsible but also for an explanation. Who were these people? What had influenced them? How had a group built around ideas of freedom and rejection of mainstream society become connected to acts of extreme violence? Those questions would lead detectives away from the crime scenes and toward the hidden world surrounding Charles Manson. The answers would eventually come from people who had been inside that world. But before the investigation could reach that point, law enforcement had to navigate weeks of uncertainty, conflicting information, and false leads. The path toward the truth would not be straightforward. It would require investigators to understand not only what happened during those August nights, but also the psychological environment that made those events possible. And that investigation would reveal a story far larger than anyone initially expected. In the aftermath of the events of August 1969, the investigation did not begin with certainty. It began with confusion. For the detectives assigned to the case, the first challenge was not identifying a suspect. It was understanding what kind of crime they were looking at. The scenes they encountered did not immediately fit into the familiar categories that investigators often rely upon. There was no obvious personal dispute, no clear financial motive, and no immediate connection between the victims and whoever had entered their homes. Instead, there were questions. Why these people? Why these locations? Why leave behind messages that appeared to have symbolic meaning? The first hours of an investigation are often critical. Every detail matters. Every observation can potentially change the direction of the case. Detectives know that early assumptions can become dangerous if they are not supported by evidence, yet they must also make decisions while information remains incomplete. In this case, the uncertainty was overwhelming. At the Cielo Drive residence, investigators were confronted with the reality of a scene that seemed impossible to reconcile with the peaceful image of the neighborhood surrounding it. The home belonged to people connected to Hollywood, a world many outsiders associated with success, creativity, and privilege. Yet inside that private space, investigators found evidence of a tragedy that immediately attracted national attention. The victims were carefully identified, and authorities began the difficult process of reconstructing the final hours of their lives. Detectives spoke with friends, examined relationships, reviewed movements, and attempted to determine whether any of the victims had been targeted individually. At first, the answers were unclear. Sharon Tate's public profile naturally drew attention. Because she was a recognizable figure in the entertainment industry, many people wondered whether her profession or personal relationships had played a role. Investigators examined possible connections, but no simple explanation emerged. The same uncertainty surrounded the other victims. Jay Sebring was successful and well known among Hollywood professionals, but nothing immediately suggested that his career had placed him in danger. Abigail Folger and Wojciech Frykowski were connected to creative circles, but they appeared to have no known conflict that would explain what had happened. Stephen Parent was especially difficult to understand. Unlike the others, he was not part of the Hollywood social world. His presence at the property was connected to circumstances unrelated to the others, making his death even more difficult for investigators to place within a motive. The case became a puzzle with missing pieces. Then came the second location. The deaths of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca created another layer of confusion. The victims lived a very different life from those connected to Cielo Drive. They were not celebrities. They were not associated with Hollywood parties or the entertainment industry. They were a couple living an ordinary life in Los Angeles. At first glance, the two cases appeared separate. Different homes. Different victims. Different social backgrounds. Yet investigators began noticing similarities that suggested they might not be unrelated. The messages left at both locations became one of the most unusual aspects of the investigation. They appeared deliberate, as though the perpetrators wanted to communicate something. To detectives, these words were not random acts of destruction. They represented a possible window into the thinking of whoever had committed the crimes. But understanding those messages proved difficult. Investigators were forced to consider possibilities that extended beyond traditional criminal motives. This was not simply a robbery gone wrong. There appeared to be no straightforward personal revenge. The evidence suggested that the people responsible were motivated by ideas that existed outside normal reasoning. At that stage, however, authorities did not yet know about Charles Manson or the group that surrounded him. The investigation moved through uncertainty. Like many major criminal cases, it contained false leads and unanswered questions. Detectives examined information that later proved irrelevant. They followed possible connections that disappeared after closer examination. The pressure increased as the public demanded answers and the media continued reporting every development. Behind the headlines, investigators worked through details that would never appear in newspapers. They reviewed timelines. They compared information from different sources. They attempted to understand relationships between people who appeared completely disconnected. The challenge was not simply finding evidence. It was recognizing which evidence mattered. Meanwhile, the fear created by the crimes spread throughout Los Angeles. Many residents began reconsidering their assumptions about safety. The idea that a quiet neighborhood could become the location of such a shocking event changed the way people viewed their surroundings. The murders also created a larger cultural conversation. Many Americans had spent the late 1960s questioning traditional ideas about society, authority, and identity. Alternative communities had appeared across the country, and some people began wondering whether these movements contained hidden dangers. The eventual connection to the Manson family would intensify those fears, even though the vast majority of alternative communities had no connection to violence. For law enforcement, the immediate concern was more practical. Who had done this? And would they strike again? The answer would eventually come from an unexpected direction. The breakthrough would not begin with a dramatic discovery at a crime scene. It would begin with information from someone who had been close to the people responsible. Before that happened, however, the investigation had to pass through one of its most difficult stages, a period when detectives were searching through possibilities without knowing that the key to solving the case was already within reach. The group responsible had not vanished completely. They had left behind a trail. The challenge was learning how to follow it. As investigators continued examining the evidence, they slowly moved away from the idea that these crimes were isolated acts. The unusual nature of the scenes suggested planning. The similarities between locations suggested coordination. The strange references found at the properties suggested that the perpetrators were attempting to express a belief system. A new possibility began to emerge. Perhaps the answer was not hidden in the victims' lives. Perhaps it was hidden in the lives of those who committed the crimes. That shift in perspective would change everything. The investigation would soon move from quiet neighborhoods and evidence rooms into the hidden world of a small group living on the outskirts of society. A world built around one man's influence. A world where loyalty had replaced independence. A world that investigators had not yet fully discovered. And somewhere inside that world were the people who held the answers to one of the most disturbing criminal mysteries in American history. As the investigation continued through the weeks following the Tate LaBianca murders, law enforcement faced a problem that would become familiar in many complex criminal cases. There was no single path leading directly to the truth. Instead, there were fragments. Small pieces of information. Separate stories that did not yet appear connected. The detectives working the case were not searching for a simple explanation. They were trying to understand a crime that seemed to exist outside the usual patterns they had encountered before. The victims came from different backgrounds. The locations appeared unrelated. The possible motives seemed unclear. Every answer created more questions. At the beginning, investigators examined the most common possibilities. They looked into personal conflicts, professional disputes, and relationships surrounding the victims. They considered whether the crimes were connected to someone known by the victims or whether there was a specific reason these individuals had been targeted. But each direction seemed to lead nowhere. The people closest to the victims struggled with their own uncertainty. Families and friends searched for explanations while dealing with a reality that felt impossible to accept. For them, the investigation was not merely a police operation. It was a desperate search for understanding. Who had taken away the people they loved? Why had they been chosen? And would the person responsible ever be found? Meanwhile, detectives continued studying the evidence left behind. The unusual messages discovered at the crime scenes remained one of the most confusing elements. They appeared to represent something larger than random acts of violence. They suggested that whoever was responsible wanted to communicate an idea, even if that idea was difficult to understand. This led investigators into unfamiliar territory. Traditional criminal investigations often focus on relationships, financial motives, or personal conflicts. But this case increasingly appeared connected to ideology and group influence. The possibility that the crimes had been committed by members of a group was beginning to emerge. Yet identifying that group proved extremely difficult. At the same time, another investigation was developing in the background. Authorities were looking into various crimes and suspicious activities involving young people living around the outskirts of Los Angeles. Among those being examined were individuals connected to a community known as the Manson family. At the time, however, few people understood the significance of that name. The group was not a formal organization. It had no official structure, no public identity, and no clear presence in mainstream society. It existed mostly through personal relationships centered around Charles Manson and the people who followed him. To outsiders, they could appear like many other groups that had formed during the era. Young people living together, rejecting conventional lifestyles, searching for alternative ways of experiencing the world. But beneath that surface was a much more complicated dynamic. Members of the group had become increasingly dependent on Manson's approval and guidance. His beliefs shaped how they viewed society, their relationships, and even their own identities. This influence became one of the central issues investigators would later examine. The question was not only what crimes had occurred. The question was how individuals who had once lived ordinary lives became willing to participate in them. As detectives followed different leads, information slowly began connecting separate pieces of the investigation. Some names appeared repeatedly. Some stories from different sources began to overlap. The boundaries between unrelated cases started becoming less clear. One important connection came through law enforcement contacts who were already familiar with members of the Manson group because of other criminal activity. Authorities had encountered individuals connected to the group before, but at the time, there was no clear reason to connect them to the Tate and LaBianca murders. The investigation was moving through a difficult stage where knowledge existed, but the significance of that knowledge had not yet been recognized. This is often one of the most challenging moments in criminal investigations. The truth may already be present, but investigators do not yet know which details will unlock the entire case. The turning point began when information emerged from inside the group itself. Susan Atkins, one of the Manson family members involved in the crimes, eventually revealed information about the murders while speaking with another inmate. The details she shared created a connection between the group and the crimes that investigators had been unable to establish. Her statements became a crucial development. For investigators, this was the moment when suspicion began transforming into a possible explanation. The strange messages, the unusual circumstances, and the lack of an obvious motive started to make sense within a larger framework. The focus shifted toward Charles Manson and his followers. But building a case would require more than suspicion. Investigators needed evidence. They needed witnesses willing to tell what had happened. They needed people from inside the group who could explain the structure, the beliefs, and the events leading up to the murders. One of the most important figures to emerge was Linda Kasabian. Unlike some of the others involved, Kasabian became a key witness for the prosecution. Her role was complicated. She had been present during events connected to the crimes, but she later cooperated with authorities and provided information about the group's activities. Her testimony would become one of the most important elements of the prosecution's case. Through her account, investigators gained insight into the movements of the group, the relationships between members, and the influence Charles Manson held over those around him. The investigation was no longer simply about finding unknown attackers. The suspects now had names. They had histories. They had a connection to a specific belief system. The public reaction changed dramatically as more information became available. The idea that a small group living on the margins of society could be responsible for such crimes captured national attention. Newspapers and television programs focused heavily on Charles Manson, transforming him into a symbol of a darker side of the late 1960s. But investigators understood that the case was more complicated than a single individual. They were examining a network of relationships. They were studying how influence operated inside the group. They were trying to understand how a person could encourage others to cross moral boundaries they might once have considered impossible to cross. The investigation revealed that the most important evidence was not only physical. It was psychological. The story of the Manson family became a study in control, persuasion, and group dynamics. It raised questions that extended beyond one criminal case. How much power can one person have over another? How does isolation change judgment? How can loyalty become stronger than personal morality? Those questions would continue throughout the trial and long after the verdicts were delivered. By the end of 1969, the mystery surrounding the Tate and LaBianca murders was beginning to unravel. The investigators who had spent months searching through uncertainty were finally moving toward a clear picture of what had happened. But uncovering the truth was only the beginning. The next challenge would be proving it. Inside a courtroom watched by the entire nation, prosecutors would attempt to explain not only the crimes themselves, but the invisible forces that connected them. And at the center of that trial would stand Charles Manson, a man who had never personally carried out the killings, yet whose influence over those who did would become the central issue of the case. By the beginning of 1970, the investigation into the Tate-LaBianca murders had moved from uncertainty into a new and much more focused phase. For months, detectives had worked through conflicting information, examined countless details, and attempted to understand how two seemingly unrelated tragedies could have occurred within such a short period of time. The answer was finally beginning to emerge. But it did not come from a single piece of physical evidence or a dramatic discovery at a crime scene. It came from people. From conversations. From individuals who had been close enough to the events to reveal what had happened inside the hidden world surrounding Charles Manson. The turning point began when investigators learned that Susan Atkins, one of the women connected to the Manson family, had spoken about the murders while in custody on an unrelated matter. Her statements provided authorities with information that connected the group to the crimes that had remained unsolved. For investigators who had spent months searching for a direction, this information changed everything. The case was no longer a mystery without a center. There was now a possible explanation. The strange references left at the crime scenes, the unusual circumstances surrounding the victims, and the connection to a small isolated group could finally be viewed as parts of the same story. The investigation turned toward the people living under Charles Manson's influence. As detectives examined the group more closely, they discovered a community built around a powerful internal hierarchy. Charles Manson was not simply another member of the group. He was the central figure whose opinions shaped the beliefs and actions of those around him. Former members and investigators would later describe a system where Manson's approval became extremely important. He positioned himself as someone who possessed special knowledge about the future and encouraged followers to see the outside world as something dangerous or corrupt. This created a separation between the group and society beyond it. The more isolated members became, the more dependent they became on the people within the group. For investigators, understanding this environment was essential. The case was not only about identifying who had been present during the crimes. It was also about understanding why certain individuals had followed Manson's commands and how his influence had developed over time. One of the most important developments came from Linda Kasabian. Her involvement in the events created a complicated legal and moral situation. She had been present with members of the group during the crimes, but she later chose to cooperate with authorities. Her decision provided investigators with information they had not previously possessed. Through her account, prosecutors gained insight into the movements of the group and the events leading up to the murders. She described the relationships between members and the role Charles Manson played in directing them. Her cooperation would become a major factor in the prosecution's ability to build a case. However, relying on witnesses from inside a criminal group presented its own challenges. The defense would later question their credibility. Their actions, their motives, and their personal histories would all become subjects of examination. Prosecutors understood that a successful case would require more than accusations. They needed to demonstrate a clear connection between Manson's influence and the actions of those who carried out the crimes. The investigation also revealed the importance of another member of the group, Charles Tex Watson. Watson had been identified as a major participant in the events. Unlike Manson, who was accused of directing and influencing others, Watson was directly involved in carrying out the crimes. His role became central to understanding how the plans had been executed. The emerging picture was disturbing not because it suggested a random act of violence, but because it suggested organization and purpose. Investigators believed the crimes were connected to Manson's apocalyptic ideas, including his belief in a coming conflict he called helter-skelter. Manson's interpretation of this concept was deeply distorted. He connected cultural events, racial tensions, and popular music into a personal theory about an approaching social collapse. Within the isolated environment of the group, these ideas gained influence. To investigators and prosecutors, this belief system became a key part of explaining motive. The crimes were not simply acts without meaning. They were connected to a worldview created and reinforced within the group. As authorities gathered evidence, arrests were made. Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and other members connected to the crimes were taken into custody. The news immediately attracted national attention. The public had followed the case from its earliest days, first through fear and uncertainty, then through fascination as the identity of the suspects became known. The discovery that the crimes were connected to a group of young people living outside mainstream society shocked many Americans. Charles Manson quickly became the face of the case. Newspapers published his image repeatedly. Television programs analyzed his background. The public tried to understand how someone with no traditional position of power could influence others so deeply. But investigators understood that focusing only on Manson risked overlooking the larger issue. The case represented something more complex. It was about leadership and followers, influence and responsibility, choice and manipulation. Those questions would become central once the case entered the courtroom. Before the trial began, prosecutors had to organize a massive amount of evidence. They had to explain a story involving multiple defendants, different locations, and events that unfolded over several days. They needed to show the jury not only what happened, but why it happened. The prosecution's argument would be built around the idea that Charles Manson did not need to physically participate in the killings to be responsible for them. They argued that his influence over the group, his instructions, and his ability to direct the actions of his followers made him legally accountable. This would become one of the most closely examined aspects of the case. Could someone who did not personally commit the act of killing still be held responsible for murder? The answer would have consequences far beyond this single trial. As preparations continued, the case moved closer to the courtroom. The investigation that had begun with unanswered questions was now becoming a legal battle that would capture international attention. The evidence had created a narrative. The witnesses had provided a path through the confusion. The suspects had been identified. Now the justice system would determine responsibility. Inside the courtroom, Charles Manson and his followers would face not only prosecutors, but also a public that wanted to understand how such a tragedy could have occurred. The trial would become one of the most extraordinary legal proceedings of the 20th century. And at its center would be a question that continues to be debated decades later. Where does the responsibility end when influence becomes control? When the trial of Charles Manson and his followers began in 1970, it quickly became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in the United States. The courtroom became a place where two very different stories collided. One story focused on the victims, the evidence, and the responsibility of those accused. The other focused on influence, belief, and the complicated question of how much control one person could have over the actions of others. For prosecutors, the challenge was clear. They needed to explain a case that was unlike many murder trials before it. Charles Manson had not personally carried out the killings. He had not been the person who entered the homes or directly attacked the victims. Instead, the prosecution argued that his role was even more complex. He had created the environment, shaped the beliefs of his followers, and directed them toward committing acts they would not have otherwise carried out. The central argument was based on the idea of responsibility through influence and planning. The prosecution presented evidence showing the relationship between Manson and the members of his group. They described a community where his opinions carried enormous weight and where followers increasingly accepted his interpretations of reality. The state argued that the crimes were not isolated actions by individuals but the result of a belief system built around Manson's authority. The defense, however, challenged this interpretation. They questioned the reliability of witnesses who had been members of the group. They argued that some individuals involved in the crimes had their own motivations and that the prosecution was attempting to place too much responsibility on Manson alone. As the trial continued, the courtroom became a reflection of the larger questions surrounding the case. Was Charles Manson a mastermind who controlled others? Or was he simply one person among several responsible individuals? How should the law respond when persuasion becomes powerful enough to influence someone's actions? These questions made the trial significant beyond the specific events of 1969. The proceedings also drew attention because of Charles Manson's behavior inside the courtroom. He frequently challenged the authority of the court, interrupted proceedings, and attempted to present himself as someone being persecuted rather than someone facing serious criminal accusations. His actions attracted enormous media coverage. Outside the courtroom, journalists followed every development. The trial became a national conversation about crime, youth culture, social change, and the fears many Americans felt about the uncertain direction of the late 1960s. However, behind the attention surrounding Manson was a legal process focused on evidence and testimony. The prosecution relied heavily on witnesses who had been connected to the group. Among the most important was Linda Kasabian, whose testimony helped explain the movements of the group and the events surrounding the crimes. Her position was complicated. She had been present during the events, making her part of the story, but she also became a key witness for the prosecution. Her cooperation provided investigators and prosecutors with information that helped connect the defendants and establish the broader structure of the case. The jury was asked to consider not only what individual defendants had done, but also how their actions fit into the larger plan presented by the prosecution. The trial also examined the role of Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and Charles Watson. Each had different levels of involvement and different circumstances surrounding their participation. The court had to evaluate their individual responsibilities while also considering the influence that existed within the group. As testimony continued, the public fascination with the case grew. Newspapers reported on courtroom developments daily. Television audiences followed the trial closely. Charles Manson became one of the most recognizable criminal figures in America, sometimes overshadowing the victims whose lives had been taken. This imbalance would later become a subject of criticism. Many observers argued that the attention given to Manson risked turning him into a symbol of notoriety while reducing the memory of the people who had suffered. Over time, historians and victim advocates emphasized the importance of remembering Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, Stephen Parent, Leno LaBianca, and Rosemary LaBianca as individuals rather than simply names connected to a famous case. After months of testimony, the jury reached its decision. Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were found guilty of murder and conspiracy. Charles Watson was also convicted separately for his role in the crimes. The sentences reflected the seriousness of the convictions. The defendants originally received death sentences, but changes in California law later resulted in those sentences being converted to life imprisonment. The verdict brought legal closure, but it did not erase the questions raised by the case. For the families of the victims, a conviction could never restore what had been lost. The legal process could establish responsibility, but it could not return the futures that had disappeared. For society, the case became a lasting study of manipulation, group psychology, and criminal responsibility. It changed how many people viewed destructive groups and increased public awareness of how charismatic individuals could influence vulnerable people. Researchers examined the Manson family as an example of extreme group control, studying the methods through which isolation and dependency could alter decision-making. The case also influenced the legal system's understanding of shared responsibility. The conviction of Charles Manson demonstrated that a person could face severe criminal consequences even without directly carrying out the physical act of violence if prosecutors could prove their role in planning, encouraging, or directing the crime. Decades later, the courtroom images remain familiar: Manson seated among his followers, journalists gathered outside, families waiting for justice, and a nation attempting to understand what had happened. But the most important outcome of the trial was not the creation of a notorious criminal figure. It was the recognition that behind every legal argument were real people whose lives had been permanently changed. Justice in the courtroom answered questions about guilt and punishment. It could not answer every question about human behavior. It could not fully explain how trust became obedience, or how a search for belonging became a path toward destruction. Those questions would continue to be studied long after the verdicts were announced. And as the years passed, the case would move from a headline about a shocking crime into a broader examination of influence, responsibility, and the fragile boundaries between loyalty and control. The story of the Tate-LaBianca murders did not end when the courtroom doors closed. A verdict could determine legal responsibility. A sentence could establish punishment. But the effects of those August nights in 1969 continued for decades, shaping the lives of families, influencing criminal investigations, and changing the way society understood manipulation and destructive groups. For the families of the victims, time did not erase the loss. The legal proceedings brought answers about who was responsible, but they could not restore the people who had been taken away. Behind the public attention, the newspaper headlines, and the endless discussions about Charles Manson, there remained a much more personal reality. There were parents who lost children, friends who lost companions, families who had to continue living with memories of people whose futures had been interrupted. The names connected to the case became known around the world, but for those who loved them, they represented something far more meaningful than a historical event. They represented lives. Sharon Tate was remembered not only as an actress whose career was still developing, but as a daughter, a friend, and a young woman preparing for motherhood. Those close to her continued to emphasize the warmth and kindness they had known before the tragedy transformed her name into part of a criminal investigation. Jay Sebring was remembered not simply as a Hollywood hairstylist, but as a creative professional whose work had influenced the appearance of an entire era. Friends recalled his generosity, his ambition, and his loyalty to the people around him. Abigail Folger was remembered for her intelligence, compassion, and interest in helping others. Her life was not defined by the circumstances of her death, but by the values and relationships she had built. Wojciech Frykowski was remembered as a person shaped by his experiences as an immigrant, a creative thinker, and someone searching for opportunities in a new environment. Stephen Parent was remembered as a young man at the beginning of adulthood, someone whose story was cut short before he had the chance to discover what his future might become. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were remembered as individuals whose lives reflected the ordinary hopes shared by millions of people: work, family, stability, and the simple expectation of another day. This emphasis on remembering the victims became increasingly important as the years passed. The notoriety surrounding Charles Manson often dominated public discussion of the case. His appearance, behavior, and personality attracted enormous media attention, sometimes creating the risk that the person responsible would become more recognizable than the people who suffered because of his actions. Over time, many historians, journalists, and advocates argued for a different approach, one that placed the victims back at the center of the story. The case was not only about a criminal. It was about human lives. Beyond the personal losses, the Manson case also had a lasting impact on American society. Before 1969, many people viewed certain alternative communities and counterculture movements through the lens of curiosity or fascination. The Manson family changed that perception for many Americans. The idea that a small isolated group could become connected to extreme violence created widespread concern about manipulation, psychological influence, and the dangers of destructive leadership. Researchers began examining the dynamics of groups built around charismatic figures. They studied how isolation, emotional dependence, and pressure to conform could affect individual decision-making. One of the most important lessons from the case was that manipulation rarely happens instantly. It often develops gradually. A person may first be attracted by friendship, acceptance, or a sense of belonging. Over time, those same connections can become tools of control if a leader discourages independent thinking and demands complete loyalty. The Manson family became one of the most studied examples of this process. The case also changed public understanding of criminal responsibility. Charles Manson's conviction demonstrated that the law could hold someone accountable not only for direct actions but also for participation in planning and encouraging crimes. This principle continues to influence discussions about conspiracy, group responsibility, and the role of leadership in criminal acts. In the decades following the trial, the individuals convicted in connection with the murders remained in prison while courts considered various appeals and parole requests. Some members expressed remorse and sought release after many years. Others continued to debate their own responsibility and involvement. Charles Manson remained incarcerated until his death in 2017. Even after his death, public interest in the case continued. Books, documentaries, films, and academic studies revisited the events from different perspectives. Some explored the criminal investigation. Others focused on psychology, media coverage, or the cultural environment of the late 1960s. But every retelling carried the responsibility of balancing public interest with respect for those who were harmed. True crime has the power to educate. It can reveal failures in investigations, examine patterns of behavior, and help society recognize warning signs. But it also carries the responsibility of remembering that these stories involve real people, not fictional characters. The Tate-LaBianca case remains disturbing because it challenges simple explanations. It is tempting to search for one reason, one moment, or one person who can explain everything. But the reality was more complicated. It involved a leader who developed a dangerous belief system. It involved followers whose identities became increasingly connected to that system. It involved a cultural moment filled with uncertainty and change. It involved victims whose ordinary hopes and futures were taken away. And it involved investigators, prosecutors, families, and communities trying to make sense of something that seemed almost impossible to understand. More than half a century later, the case continues to raise difficult questions. How does influence become control? How can individuals lose their connection to their own moral boundaries? How can society recognize danger before tragedy occurs? There are no simple answers. But studying cases like this remains important because understanding the past can help identify patterns in the present. The final lesson of the Manson case is not the creation of a famous criminal name. It is a reminder that behind every headline are real people. People who had dreams. People who had relationships. People who expected tomorrow to arrive. The victims of the Tate LaBianca murders were not defined by the final moments of their lives. Their stories existed before those events, and their humanity remains the most important part of remembering them. History often remembers moments of darkness. But the responsibility of telling those stories is to also remember the lives that existed before the darkness arrived. More than 5 decades have passed since the summer of 1969, yet the name Charles Manson continues to appear whenever people discuss the most infamous criminal cases in American history. His name became a symbol of manipulation, a symbol of destructive influence, a symbol of the frightening possibility that ordinary people can be drawn into extraordinary acts under the power of a deeply controlling individual. But the passage of time has also created an opportunity to look beyond the image that surrounded Charles Manson and return to the people whose lives were changed forever. Because the lasting meaning of this case is not found only in the person who caused the destruction. It is found in understanding how that destruction became possible, and in remembering those who never had the chance to continue their stories. The Tate LaBianca murders remain one of the most studied criminal cases in modern history because they challenged many assumptions people held about crime. Before this case, many Americans imagined violent criminals through a familiar image: someone acting alone, someone driven by obvious anger, revenge, or personal gain. The Manson case presented something different. It showed a situation where influence, ideology, and group dynamics played a central role. The crimes forced investigators, psychologists, and the public to examine questions that extended beyond the courtroom. What makes someone surrender their own judgment? How can a person become so committed to a leader that they accept ideas they once would have rejected? Why do some individuals resist manipulation while others become deeply attached to it? These questions have continued to influence research into coercive control and destructive groups. The case became an example frequently examined by experts studying how isolation can affect human behavior. When individuals are separated from outside perspectives and surrounded by a single dominant worldview, their understanding of reality can gradually change. This process does not happen overnight. It develops through repeated interactions, emotional pressure, and the gradual replacement of independent thinking with loyalty to the group. The Manson family remains one of the most recognized examples of these dynamics, not because it represented an entire generation or cultural movement, but because it demonstrated the extreme consequences that can occur when influence becomes absolute. The late 1960s were a period of enormous social transformation in America. Many young people questioned traditional expectations and searched for new ways to understand society, spirituality, and personal freedom. Most of those movements were peaceful. Most people involved in alternative communities were not seeking violence. The Manson family was a small but devastating exception. Understanding that distinction remains important because historical events are often simplified after the fact. The complexity of an era can disappear when one shocking event becomes the symbol through which an entire generation is remembered. The tragedy of 1969 should not be used to erase the broader cultural history of the time. Instead, it should remind people that moments of social change can contain both hope and vulnerability. For law enforcement, the case created important lessons as well. The investigation demonstrated the importance of examining relationships, group structures, and psychological factors when traditional motives do not explain a crime. Detectives were not simply searching for a person who committed an act. They were uncovering a network of influence. The prosecution's successful argument against Charles Manson also became significant in discussions of criminal responsibility. The case reinforced the idea that responsibility can extend beyond the person physically carrying out an action when someone plays a meaningful role in planning, encouraging, or directing criminal behavior. That legal principle continues to influence conversations about conspiracy and accountability. However, legal conclusions cannot fully measure human loss. For families of the victims, there was no verdict capable of restoring what had been taken. Justice could acknowledge responsibility. It could create a record of what happened. But it could never return the conversations that would never happen again, the birthdays that would never be celebrated, or the futures that would never unfold. This is why remembering the victims remains essential. Sharon Tate was more than a name connected to a crime. She was a daughter, a friend, an actress, and a person preparing to become a mother. Jay Sebring was more than a victim in a famous case. He was a creative professional who changed his industry and built meaningful relationships throughout his life. Abigail Folger was more than a headline. She was someone who cared about literature, social issues, and helping others. Wojciech Frykowski was more than a detail in an investigation. He was an individual with his own history, ambitions, and experiences as someone building a life far from where he was born. Stephen Parent was more than an unexpected name connected to tragedy. He was an 18-year-old beginning adulthood, with interests, relationships, and possibilities still ahead of him. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were more than victims in a second crime scene. They were a couple with their own routines, memories, and connections to the people who loved them. Their lives deserve to be remembered separately from the circumstances that ended them. Over the years, the case has appeared repeatedly in books, documentaries, and films. Each generation discovers it again, often asking the same questions that have remained unanswered for decades. How could this happen? How did people become willing to participate? Could something similar happen again? The value of studying history is not that it provides perfect answers. Often, it does not. Instead, history gives society the opportunity to recognize patterns. It teaches that charisma is not the same as wisdom. That certainty is not always truth. That belonging can become dangerous when it requires surrendering personal judgment. And that understanding human behavior requires looking beyond simple explanations. Charles Manson died in 2017 while serving a life sentence. His death ended the life of a man whose name had become associated with one of America's darkest chapters. But it did not end the conversations surrounding the case. Those conversations continue because the questions raised by the events of 1969 remain relevant. The world continues to experience moments of uncertainty. People continue searching for meaning, connection, and belonging. Leaders continue to appear promising simple solutions to complicated problems. The lessons of the Manson case remain a reminder that critical thinking, compassion, and awareness of manipulation are essential parts of a healthy society. The final chapter of this story is not about a criminal who became famous. It is about remembering what was lost. It is about recognizing the humanity of those whose lives ended too soon. It is about understanding that behind every historical event are individuals who once laughed, dreamed, worked, loved, and planned for futures they expected to see. The names associated with the Tate-LaBianca case will forever be connected to one of the most disturbing crimes in American history. But the most meaningful way to remember them is not through the darkness that surrounded their deaths. It is through the lives they lived before it. Because history should not only record how people are lost. It should preserve who they were. The story of the Manson family has remained one of the most examined examples of psychological influence in modern criminal history, not only because of the crimes committed, but because of the difficult question behind them. How does one person gain enough influence over others that they begin to accept ideas, behaviors, and actions that would once have seemed impossible? The answer is not found in a single moment. It is not found in one conversation, one decision, or one dramatic transformation. Psychologists who study destructive groups often describe influence as a gradual process. A person rarely wakes up one morning and completely abandons their previous beliefs. Instead, change often happens through a series of small steps, where each new commitment feels connected to the last. This gradual process is one of the reasons the Manson case continues to receive attention from researchers. The members of the group did not begin their relationship with Charles Manson as a group of people seeking violence. Many were young individuals searching for connection, identity, or a place where they felt accepted. Their backgrounds varied, but they shared something common with many people their age during that period: a desire to find meaning in a rapidly changing world. The late 1960s created an environment where many traditional ideas were being questioned. Young people across America challenged social expectations. Some rejected conventional career paths. Some explored alternative spiritual practices. Some moved into communal living arrangements because they believed cooperation and shared experiences could create a better way of life. For many, these experiences were positive. But any environment where people are searching for belonging can also create opportunities for manipulation. A person who appears to offer understanding and acceptance can become extremely influential, especially when they position themselves as someone who has special knowledge or answers that others do not possess. This was one of the ways Charles Manson gained authority within his group. His influence did not come from an official position or traditional power. He did not lead through a government role, financial control, or public reputation. Instead, his power developed through personal relationships and psychological dependence. He presented himself as someone who understood the world differently. To followers, he often appeared confident in moments when they felt uncertain. He offered explanations for their frustrations and fears. He created a sense that they were part of something unusual and important. This feeling of being chosen can be extremely powerful. Many destructive groups throughout history have relied on a similar idea: the belief that members possess a special understanding that outsiders cannot see. Once that belief becomes strong, criticism from the outside world may no longer weaken the group. Instead, criticism can strengthen it. Members may begin interpreting disagreement as proof that outsiders simply do not understand their truth. Friends and family members who express concern may be viewed as threats rather than people attempting to help. This creates a psychological barrier between the group and the outside world. Isolation becomes more than physical distance. It becomes emotional separation. The person begins relying increasingly on the group for identity, approval, and decision-making. Within the Manson family, investigators later found evidence of a highly centralized influence structure. Members looked to Manson for guidance and interpreted his ideas as meaningful explanations of their experiences. Over time, the boundaries between personal choice and group expectation became increasingly unclear. This raises an important question. Were the followers responsible for their actions? The answer is complicated. Understanding manipulation does not remove individual responsibility. Adults are responsible for their choices, especially when those choices harm others. At the same time, studying psychological influence helps explain how people can be pushed toward decisions that appear completely inconsistent with their earlier personalities. Human behavior is rarely simple. People are capable of both independent judgment and vulnerability to pressure. The Manson family became an example of what can happen when a person's need for belonging becomes connected to a system that discourages questioning. Another important psychological element was the creation of a shared reality. Inside tightly controlled groups, beliefs can become reinforced through constant repetition. When everyone around a person accepts the same ideas, those ideas may begin to feel normal regardless of how unusual they appear from the outside. The group environment becomes its own world. Information from outside is rejected. Internal beliefs become stronger. The leader's interpretation becomes the accepted explanation for events. This does not happen only in criminal organizations. Similar psychological patterns have been observed in various types of high-control environments throughout history. The Manson case became particularly significant because those psychological dynamics were connected to extreme criminal behavior. Researchers studying the case often emphasize that charisma alone does not explain destructive influence. Charisma can inspire people to create, cooperate, and help others. The danger appears when charisma combines with control. A healthy leader encourages independent thought. A destructive leader demands obedience. A healthy community allows disagreement. A destructive group treats disagreement as betrayal. A healthy relationship allows individuals to maintain their own identity. A destructive environment replaces individual identity with complete loyalty to the group. These differences help explain why studying the Manson family remains relevant. The case also challenges the common belief that people involved in destructive groups are somehow completely different from everyone else. That idea can be comforting because it suggests manipulation could never happen to ordinary people. History shows otherwise. People from many backgrounds have become involved with harmful groups throughout time. Intelligence, education, or social status alone do not make someone immune to psychological influence. Human beings are social by nature. The desire to belong is one of the strongest forces in human behavior. The same need that helps people build friendships, families, and communities can become a vulnerability when someone deliberately exploits it. This does not mean people are powerless. Awareness creates protection. The ability to question information, maintain relationships outside a group, and accept disagreement as normal are important safeguards against manipulation. The lessons of the Manson family extend beyond one criminal case. They are about recognizing the difference between guidance and control, between community and isolation, between loyalty and obedience. The tragedy of the case was not only the violence that occurred. It was also the transformation of individuals who became deeply connected to a worldview that led them toward irreversible decisions. Understanding that transformation does not excuse what happened. Instead, it helps society recognize warning signs earlier and better understand the complex nature of human behavior. More than 50 years later, the Manson case continues to be studied because it represents one of the most difficult questions in psychology and criminology. How can ordinary human needs, the need for acceptance, purpose, and connection, become tools of destruction when placed in the hands of someone seeking control? The answer remains a warning. Belonging is powerful. Influence is powerful. And the responsibility to question, think independently, and protect human dignity remains essential. When the first reports of the Tate LaBianca murders reached the public in 1969, Americans were not only confronted with a shocking criminal investigation. They were introduced to a story that seemed almost impossible to understand. A young actress. A group of mysterious followers. A hidden community outside the edges of mainstream society. A leader whose influence appeared to reach far beyond ordinary persuasion. The combination of these elements created a case that captured public attention unlike almost any other crime of the era. But as the years passed, another story began developing alongside the historical facts. The story of the Manson case itself became a cultural phenomenon. It became a subject of books, documentaries, films, interviews, academic studies, and endless public discussion. Charles Manson's image appeared repeatedly in newspapers and on television screens, sometimes becoming so dominant that it overshadowed the people whose lives had been taken. This created one of the most important discussions surrounding the case. How does society remember a crime? And who gets remembered when a tragedy becomes famous? In the immediate aftermath of the murders, the public reaction was shaped by fear and confusion. Many people struggled to understand how such crimes could happen in a city that represented creativity, entertainment, and opportunity. Los Angeles had always carried an image of dreams. Hollywood represented success. The entertainment industry represented imagination. But the crimes associated with the Manson family introduced a darker possibility: that danger could exist beneath familiar surroundings. The media responded quickly. Newspapers competed to uncover new details. Television programs analyzed every development. Journalists searched for explanations that could help the public understand a case that seemed to challenge traditional ideas about crime. The attention was understandable. The case contained elements that naturally attracted public interest. There was a famous actress. There was a group living outside normal society. There was a charismatic figure at the center. There were questions about influence, belief, and human behavior. Together, these elements created a narrative that was difficult for the public to ignore. However, Intense media attention also created complications. As coverage increased, Charles Manson became one of the most recognizable criminal figures in America. His appearance, statements, and courtroom behavior received enormous attention. Reporters analyzed his personality, his background, and his motivations. In many ways, the media transformed him from a defendant in a criminal case into a cultural symbol. This created a difficult balance. Understanding the person responsible was necessary for understanding the crime. But focusing too heavily on the person responsible risked giving him exactly what many destructive individuals seek: attention and recognition. Over time, historians and victim advocates emphasized the importance of shifting the focus back toward the victims. The true center of the story was not the person who caused harm. It was the people who lost their lives. This change in perspective reflected a broader evolution in true crime storytelling. Earlier coverage often focused primarily on criminals, their personalities, and their actions. Modern approaches increasingly recognize the importance of presenting victims as complete human beings. Their lives did not begin with tragedy. Their stories did not end with the crimes committed against them. They had families, friendships, careers, hopes, and identities beyond what happened in August 1969. This shift also changed how audiences approached true crime itself. True crime has always attracted public interest because it explores some of the most difficult questions about human behavior. Why do people commit terrible acts? How do investigations uncover the truth? How does the justice system determine responsibility? These questions can have educational value. They can help society understand warning signs, improve investigations, and examine failures that might otherwise be ignored. But true crime also carries ethical responsibilities. When real people are involved, entertainment and respect must be carefully balanced. A crime story is not fictional. The fear, grief, and consequences experienced by real individuals continue long after the headlines disappear. The Manson case became an important example of this debate. Some portrayals focused heavily on the shocking nature of the crimes and the personality of Charles Manson. Others attempted to examine the broader historical and psychological context, including the experiences of the victims and the social environment of the late 1960s. The difference between these approaches is significant. One approach asks, why was this criminal fascinating? The other asks, what can society learn from what happened? The second question often leads to deeper understanding. The case also influenced popular culture in numerous ways. It appeared in books, films, music references, and television discussions. For many people born decades after the events occurred, their first introduction to the case came through fictionalized portrayals rather than historical records. This created another challenge. When real events become part of popular culture, the line between history and mythology can become unclear. Certain images become repeated so often that they begin to replace more complicated realities. Charles Manson became associated with a particular public image, the mysterious cult leader with extraordinary power over others. That image contains elements of truth, but it does not explain the entire situation. The reality involved many individuals, different personalities, complex relationships, and a gradual process of influence that developed over time. Similarly, the victims were often remembered only in relation to the tragedy. A more complete understanding requires looking beyond the final moments of their lives. This is one reason modern researchers and storytellers increasingly focus on restoring humanity to people whose names became connected to historical events. The legacy of the Manson case also extends into law enforcement and psychology. Investigators learned valuable lessons about examining group dynamics and understanding crimes motivated by ideology rather than traditional personal motives. Psychologists studied the case as an example of extreme influence and the dangers of high-control environments. Legal experts examined questions surrounding responsibility, conspiracy, and the role of individuals who encourage crimes without directly carrying them out. The case also became part of broader conversations about how society responds to fear. After the murders, some people viewed alternative lifestyles and counterculture movements with increased suspicion. However, historians have emphasized that the actions of the Manson family represented an extreme exception rather than a reflection of an entire generation. The late 1960s contained many different movements, ideas, and communities. Reducing all of them to one criminal case would ignore the complexity of that period. History requires careful separation between individual actions and broader social movements. More than 50 years later, the Manson case remains powerful because it continues to raise questions that do not have simple answers. It asks how people can be influenced. It asks how society responds to fear. It asks how stories of real suffering should be told. And perhaps most importantly, it asks how memory should be preserved. The easiest way to remember a famous crime is often through the person responsible. Names like Charles Manson become permanently connected to history. But a more meaningful form of remembrance requires looking beyond notoriety. It requires remembering the people whose lives existed before the tragedy. It requires recognizing that every headline represents human experiences that cannot be reduced to a single event. The lasting legacy of the Manson case is not only the story of a criminal investigation. It is a reminder of the importance of critical thinking, compassion, and responsible storytelling. Because history is not only about what happened. It is also about how we choose to remember what happened.